But we really don't have anything similar. I mean, when you take the cases, we've had two cases in the last few years that I can think of. One of a schoolboy who got up on top of a hill and shot 9 people in cars before they got him. Another one who climbed a tower on a university campus and knocked off a few people. There must be something in this idea of the Americans being gun conscious.
They're violence conscious. Violence is much closer to the surface over there. Guns are easy to get, so guns are the natural weapon. But there's an awful... I was over in California recently, and I spent 6 very frightened weeks there. I was down in Watts a lot, you know. I was just saying before. And I was very much whitey down in Watts, you know, and I was there sort of innocently with a friend. But I felt hate, you know. They hated me just because I was there and I was white. And these sort of tensions exist in America. There are pockets of tension. The ghettos, the slums in America, where violence is very near to the surface. It's very, very frightening, you know. I suppose it exists here, but, you know, the tension isn't as great because at the moment the problem isn't as great. England isn't important enough in the world. It's not big enough power, really, for the tensions to be at the same level, I think, you know.
Without for a moment suggesting that I'm on his side in any way, shape, or form, would you think it possible that this is part of Enoch Powell's fear?
Yes, it may be, but it's part of it in the same way that people who want to bring back capital punishment fear this. I'm not on his side either. He's wrong. Yeah, I think that's part of his fear, sure.
When you talked about Watts, is it possible today to go into that part of Los Angeles without being conscious or being warned in advance that you are going into a situation in the same way that one is warned before one is taken into Harlem? You don't just wander in there, do you?
No, I went down into Watts with a couple of great big spade musicians, and that was okay, because they were wearing the full African gear, and they obviously weren't Uncle Tom spades, and that was okay, but only just okay, you know. That was all right somehow, but then there's a difference too between Watts in the daytime and Watts at night, you know. Daytime somehow the violence isn't as near, but at night time when everybody's a bit, you know, around the bars, people are stoned, then there's problems, yeah. No, they warn you in advance, don't go near Watts, don't go near Harlem, you know.
Your fear about it happening here, it would have seemed to me that the sort of thing that has happened in terms of assassination and attempted assassination in the States has happened either in a southern state where racial tension is very high, or in a kooky state like Texas, or another kooky state like California. Do you think it could happen in New England or Nebraska? Or
I don't know America well enough to know. I think it could happen anywhere. I mean, there were there's sort of a very strong right-wing element in upstate New York, surely, isn't there? Where there were a lot of demonstrations against Paul Robeson, which got very violent a few years ago, upstate New York. So if it can happen that close to New York, in what is after all sort of considered to be a very respectable and adjusted community, it can happen anywhere. It's going to happen here, I think, when there's a whole generation of Negroes that are growing up now. This is very relevant if you're not putting this up for a few years. That I think there's been, in the past they've come into the country, they've come in like Italians or Frenchmen or anybody else, they felt foreign. But there's a generation growing up now that are going to say, we are English, don't push us about, that's when we're going to have the problem,
I would take it then, don't believe in what some people describe as something innate in the British character. That
I think there's something innate in the British character which pretends the violence doesn't exist, and to an extent that remedies the violence,
but it's hypocritical in essence.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, British history proves that we're pretty violent and pretty hypocritical about our violence,
When do you really foresee in the sort of thing that's happened in the States in the last 3 or 4 years, literally the attacks on heads of state and things can you really foresee somebody shooting or knifing the Prime Minister outside Number 10 or at a public meeting?
No, this comes back to what I was saying before, because I don't think we're a sufficiently important country anymore. That the decisions that an American statesman makes are of much more consequence, because America is a much more powerful country. Therefore, the tension is greater. I mean, it really doesn't matter too much what Harold Wilson says, or what Enoch Powell says. You know, we're not important enough to affect the world that much. You know, this is, you know, improved. So I don't think that the attention will grow to that extent here. You know, unless, you know, there's a sudden sort of resurgence of British power, which I think is unlikely. You know.
Did you have the feeling from what you read in the 2 years, say, that followed the John Kennedy assassination, that there was organization involved, or that it was a happenstantial thing involving an individual?
I don't know, there was evidence, obviously, on both sides. I felt that it was organized, but I think in the end it is irrelevant, you know. All that matters is that it can happen, that it happened, you know. It causes, you know, the same man dies, life ceases. It doesn't matter how or why, you know. It just matters that it happens. I think it was organized. I've seen all this sort of the photo blow-ups which prove there was a sniper behind the fence and all this, but there seems to be as much more evidence, rather, for it being organized than just a sort of a lunatic or a sensationalist, you know.
Do you think that there is organized villainy in the world on the whole, or do you think that the people who do organize are fanatics and believe in what they're doing?
Very often they do, and these are the idealists are the ones who worry me, you know. Organized villains don't worry me too much, because they're really only after money, power even, but it's the idealists that really worry me, you know. They want to take over the world, you know.
And inflict their ideals on others.
Inflict their ideals on others, yeah. And when anybody mentions an idealist, I sort of back against the wall, and keep my hands in my pockets, you know. Because there's nobody as ruthless as an idealist, and these are the people who worry me, not the villains.
Let's take a color test on that, and then change the reel, and take the lights off here for a minute.
Marty Feldman, 4 take 2.
Marty, we're all very slow getting around to paying attention to writers in this business. And I can remember the first time your name was really pushed at me. I'd been aware of it for a while, but a man called Bill Rose, who wrote Genevieve and Mad, Mad World and a few things, said to me, you've got to watch The Army Game now that Marty Feldman's writing it. And it's the best comedy being done in this country, and that has been done for years. The next episode I watched was one in which you had Bill Fraser and Alfie Bass, I think just after they'd been demobbed, in a room which they got into, and the two of them were in bed, and they played virtually the whole show that way, and it had tremendous plausibility all the way through, and the plausibility was noticeable. Now you seem to have come full circle into a kind of fantasy world involving yourself. How did that come about?
I suppose by the process of learning what you really want to write. These were the very first things I ever wrote with Barry Took, you know. Well, almost the first. We started on the last series of Take It From Here. And we were finding out about writing, and consequently we were sort of very influenced by what was going on around, you know. And at that time, I was terribly under the influence of Pinter, you know. And the sort of theory of naturalism rather than realism, you know. Over a period of time, you get less stylized, and you get more confident in what you want to do yourself. And I suppose you don't lose these influences, but they become part of your equipment, you know. I still like writing naturalistic dialogue, naturalistic situations, but it's only part of the thing I like doing, you know. Following instinct, I think, is what I'm doing much more now.
I was going to say, I hope you don't lose the sense of writing naturalistically, because it seems to me the thing probably most lacking in this country in comedy, as opposed to the American thing, where there's a certain resentment about the slickness of American comedy, about the wisecracks, but at the same time they do have a tremendous sense of plausibility, as within the Dick Van Dyke Show,
Well,
where you can imagine
yeah.
everything happening really does happen.
Well, you've cited the best of them, you know, really, and when it's really good, you don't notice it's slick, you just notice it's good. No, that's brilliant. It's a marvellously written show, you know, and beautifully played, and I mean, hell, that sort of transcends any sort of observations about glibness, slickness. It doesn't matter, it's just a great show, you know. But most of the American situation comedies I've seen are not. They seem to be, they're manufactured rather than written, you know. And then Dick Van Dyke is an exception, as I think Bilko was an exception in its day too, you know.
How do you feel about social consciousness, social awareness in comedy writing?
Well, what you think is inevitably reflected in what you write or what you do if you're a performer, I suppose. More so in what you write. I don't see that it is the total of what you write, but it obviously influences your attitude to things, yes. Really, that's all I can say about it. You know?
What about someone like, say, Johnny Spates, Till Death Us Do Part? Now, I won't ask you to criticize that because you're a fellow writer, but it always seemed to me, I mean, if I were Johnny Spate, I'd have been a bit frightened to do another series after Enoch Powell's speech and the aftermath of the speech. It always seemed to me that possibly Johnny should have had in that situation a character who could have been as obnoxious as Alf Garnett, but had all the facts right in the pub.
Yes, I don't think it's objectively written. You know, knowing Johnny and knowing the series quite well, I think it's extremely subjective. It's written out of anger about the way the world is, you know. And he's totally involved in this. It's not really the same sort of satire as Ned Sherrin's shows. That was that sort of thing. It's much more Johnny's own personal anger, you know. It comes directly from Johnny's experience and attitudes to life. As such, I think it's extremely valid, you know.
With yourself, could you ever see yourself getting involved in a series to that extent, where you were venting personal anger?
No, not anymore. I did once. I used to write very angry things, and they weren't very funny. They were just angry. I'm not angry anymore. You know, I'm trying not to be angry anymore. It seems a terrible waste of energy, you know, in the sense that one can generate light rather than heat from the same source, and I'm more interested in light, if you know what I mean. That sounds
Yes.
awfully pretentious, but...
No, it doesn't sound
yeah.
pretentious. But you also said when you wrote angry, it wasn't very funny.
It wasn't when I wrote angry, no.
Do you think, as a rule, that probably obtains most of the time? If you're too angry, you can't write very funny.
If you're too angry, you can't be coherent, and without coherence, there can't be any kind of statement. There can't be any kind of communication. There can be. Well, this must depend on how much you can control your anger and channel it. Surely, I mean, Spike Milligan is a very angry writer, but most of the time he channels his anger, you know, and it works. It's very funny. The Goons was a very angry show, really, you know. It depends on how much you let it get on top of you, how subjective you get about your anger, you know. If you use it, if you channel it as an emotion to be used, fine.
Let's come on now to the subject of performing, which is relatively new for you on a national basis anyway. Did you have to be persuaded, or have you always been somebody who wanted to get out there in front of the camera or the audience?
Well, I started out years ago going around music halls with an act, and when the act folded, I went into television and did odd bits in various shows. And I just wasn't very good and didn't get any work. At the same time, I started writing, and I started getting work as a writer, especially when I teamed up with Barry Took. And over the years, I'd sort of forgotten about any performing ambitions. And I had to be persuaded again, because I thought I was pretty bad at it. I now know that I'm very good in certain areas, but they're very limited areas, you know. And I wouldn't care to do much performing outside of those areas, in fact, you know.
It occurred to me that in terms of the 1948 show, where you were always used for a calculated value, then the switch to your own show, where you appeared virtually in every sketch, does it ever bother you that you might, in view of the vividness of your personality, overexpose yourself?
Yeah, I didn't want to star in the show, in fact. I was persuaded to do this. When I was offered a series, I wanted to do it because I'd never done it before. But I wanted to do it as part of a team. Unfortunately, John Cleese was under contract to commercial television and couldn't do it. And the producer persuaded me to star in it. I was very frightened about it, and I thought that I've got rather an overpowering physical presence, you know, the eyes and the nose and all that. And I thought, yeah, it would get very wearing. And I'm surprised that it hasn't. You know, I think it probably will if I do very, very much television.
Do you think in future you'll go for the team thing and stay out of some of the sketches?
I don't really have any ambitions to do much performing. I'm committed to do another series, and I've sort of got myself involved in a film that I'm starting now. But these are things that just happened to come along, and they've seemed like a good idea at the time. But I don't see performing as a sort of long-term thing. I'm a writer, and that's what I want to stay. You know.
We'd hate to lose you.
I think I could outwear my welcome very easily, you know, really. It's too frenetic, you know, what I do.
I doubt that. Let's take a colour test, or did we get one? We have one. Well, let's just put on that and do one more reel if you have time.
Yeah, sure.
All right? Fine.
Marty Feldman, 4, take 3.
This is going to be kind of a complicated question, if I can work it out in my mind. When I first came to this country, there were a lot of things I was told I couldn't do in comedy. I was told them by Gilbert Harding, I was told them by Frank and Dennis. I was told you couldn't stammer, because that offended people who stammered. And I was told you couldn't do anything that indicated offense to someone with a cleft palate, or a partially cleft, things of that kind, anything that indicated this. Now, it seems to me, I'm going to refer back to something else that you said earlier when you were talking about Watts. You said I went down with a couple of big spade magicians. This was a great thing of, there are a lot of liberals who are offended by the word spade on behalf of Negroes, although a lot of Negroes accept it quite happily.
A lot of Negroes hate being called Negroes and preferably called black.
That's right. And it was a kick of Lenny Bruce's that, you know, we should get all these words out of our system and shout them to the rooftops until they didn't mean anything anymore. But there has also been a trend, I think, recently in the last year or so to go back to the thing I was talking about initially. There's no reason why you shouldn't do somebody who limps. You shouldn't do somebody, in the case of Ronnie, for example, who's had his own show, and they've made the furniture bigger and the sets bigger to point out the fact that he's small. You think this is a healthy trend generally? What do you think we should do about these things?
I don't know what you can do about it. I mean, go back even earlier to W.C. Fields. One of his classic bits was with a blind man. Do you remember that?
I do.
That, you know, in theory, jokes about anybody being blind upset you, but in the end it comes down to style. If a thing is done with style, if for some reason it doesn't upset you, or if it's done with candour, it doesn't upset you. It depends on how it's done. Are you expected to laugh at a man because he's limping? Or is it a funny action? Or who is it that is limping, you know? Or is it that you know he's not really limping, he's an actor limping? One doesn't laugh at a man limping because he's suffered an accident. You laugh at an actor limping because it's a funny movement. It depends on who the actor is and what the context is. I don't know what one can do about that.
In the same sense that Danny LaRue can get away with things in drag which other people can't, because he is so skilled and talented at what he does.
Exactly, in that sense, yeah.
Do you see any trends in comedy, or in the use of comedy, on the horizons for the future?
Yes, I think comedy is sort of, the lines are beginning to blur now between comedy and drama. And, you know, there's comedy in pop music now to an extent there never was before. This is great. You know, things like Simon Smith and his Dancing Bear is a great song. You know, The Small Faces, Lazy Sunday Afternoon, all be forgotten when the show goes up. But it's a great trend. Comedy's sort of spreading all over, you know. I can see it, it's never being used as a weapon, though. I don't think it's of any use as a weapon. I think the whole satire bit became twisted. You know, it became as if satire was something else than comedy. It was a thing on its own, you know. But I think it's the trend. I think would be towards, for the moment anyway, towards more fantasy in comedy, more sort of comedy, psychologists comedy, if you like, comedy bringing up what people think, feel, a sort of surrealism, away from the comedy of reality. Well, to a deeper reality. As surrealism is a deeper reality than what we call reality, yeah. I think there's a trend this way, yeah.
In your experience, do critics have more trouble assessing comedy than they do drama or documentary?
I could think, yeah, for the same reason that they can't criticize jazz. They're the things that you can't define, It's like, who was it? I think it was Duke Ellington said, when somebody asked him what jazz was, if you have to ask, you'll never know. It's the same with comedy. It's an instinct. How do you define it? How do you criticize an instinct? It comes down to personal tastes in the end, With comedy, does it make you laugh? With jazz, does it swing? Does it move you? And you can't criticize it beyond that. Construction has got no part of it.
It's always struck me that one of the problems with jazz is that it has lacked a sense of humor. Not always. There was a period, for instance, Art Tatum always had a sense of humor in whatever he was doing. But that jazz almost seems to have been driven into a corner in Ronnie Scott's now. Ronnie himself doesn't take it all that seriously. But jazz is losing out because it's taking itself seriously.
Yeah, but then you get people like Roland Kirk, and these are the hopes for the future. Hands up tin whistles to the audience, and it's a ball, and everybody enjoys it. This is lovely. Yes, it does take itself too seriously since it's become aware that it's an art form. As pop music, aware that it's a popular art form, has taken itself too seriously. I think it's going to break out of that, though, It's in the absence of public interest, what else can you do but reassure each other that what you're doing is worthwhile?
You sound like a Canadian. The thing that fascinates me about this is that we do tend to do that, and we tend to take ourselves very seriously. But after 25-odd years in the business, I've got a comedy playhouse going out on Friday. I've seen it. I haven't the faintest idea what the reception will be, whether it'll be good or bad. Now, have you reached a point when you've filmed or completed a show where you can say they're going to like this or they're going to hate this?
No, but I'm rapidly reaching a point where it will only matter if I like it and Barry Tokeby, who's written it with me, likes it. It will matter, of course, whether an audience like it or not, but that is a secondary consideration. The important thing is it good? And whether the comedy playhouse you've done is good, whether you're proud of it as a piece of work. Whether people will like it or not, you can't say.
Well, then, aren't you, in a sense, criticizing people? I mean, you can't operate in a vacuum.
No,
this is my own sense of disturbance at work here.
In fact, you're not disregarding people, because if what you do is you think good and valid, and you work in a mass media, and people don't like it, then nobody asks you to do any more shows, and you're out of work, and you go and do something else for a living. So in the end, they make the judgment, but you make the initial judgment, whether you will present it or not, whether you think it's good enough to be presented.
So you probably belong not in a mass media, but in a more restricted media. Perhaps what you do will work in the theater.
I think I'd like to work in the cinema more than anywhere else, where the piece of work stands up by itself. What you do in television depends very much. The way you work depends on whether the audience is laughing or not. As long as they have studio audiences, it conditions your attitude. It conditions your level of performance, and it conditions you when you're writing, because you know that audiences are going to be there and have to be made to laugh. It should be possible to make comedy like Pierre Até makes comedy films, which are much gentler. And if an audience doesn't laugh, this doesn't mean they're not funny.
When you say, I'd like to work in the cinema, do you mean direct or appear? Or
write and direct. That's what I want to do, really. Yeah.
So that you would have charge of the editing as well?
Yeah, I'm taking time out to start to learn to edit. I'll never, I've left it too late to really be an editor. But so I know something about the process of editing. So I don't think you can think of yourself as a director unless you know something about editing.
Because, we've all seen films in which a comedy actor's timing has been ruined by an editor.
Yeah.
Whereas the actor himself probably should have said, if you cut on that frame, it'll work. If you cut on the next frame, it won't.
I've also had recent personal experience of a film item which we shot, which was edited. I didn't know it was edited badly. It was edited logically, dramatically. But it wasn't funny. And the director of the show went in and re-edited it. The same shots, he threw very little out, but he re-edited the sequence and he cut a little bit off here and he linked them slightly differently. And it was very, very funny. And it was all, now the director presumably should know what he wants when he's shooting it. So the director is the man to edit, really, or to supervise the editing, you know.
And this really is what you'd like to do in the future, is get into the cinema and write and direct, and see it right through to the finished product.
That's it.
We'll cut there. But for God's sake, don't stop performing.